Welcome to the Cost of Everything podcast and the final part of our trilogy on the cost of movies. If you've listened to the previous two episodes, I highly recommend you do that before listening to this one, then you'll know that we will be discussing the creative ways of saving money in movie production and then the post-production process. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. Here is the final part of my chat with Stephen Follows. One thing that you mentioned in terms of creative ways that the people involved in the films try to save money, and it's only because I have at least one interesting fact here, because I don't know much about this kind of stuff, but there was, no, it's not a fact really, but I know that in making the movie, is it Interstellar, rather than using some farmers' crops to shoot certain scenes, they planted the crops themselves. At the end, they sold the crop for a profit. So I guess that's one way of saving money, but also I guess making a little bit of money. It doesn't matter how little it was. But what are the most sort of, I guess, creative ways that you know that people have tried to save money on in production?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is because I've heard that story as well, and I was similarly like you, like, oh, that's really creative. And then I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said that's farming. And I was like, oh yeah. And so quite often, like, yeah, it's so interesting how you put yourself in one context. And because essentially what you're doing is saying, I expect every financial number in the process of a film to be a minus. And when something's a positive, you're like, oh, wow, that's unusual. But when you step out of it, you're like, well, yeah, that's why people grow it. You know, that's what it's actually quite straightforward. And it's so interesting you get into that realm of kind of, you know, one way of seeing it. But I took the exact same journey you did. But yeah, so there's two ways you can reduce the overall cost of making a movie. You can spend less, or you can bring more in. And I'm not talking, when I say bring more in, I'm not necessarily talking about investment, although you can do that. But the problem with investment is there's a very hard line of how much you can raise, because it's based on a percentage of profits or whatever. And so when you've sold 100%, 100% sold. But you could do product placement. You know, quite often money changes hands for, you know, phone bond holds or whatever. But it doesn't also have to be money. It could be, for example, Michael Bay. You'll notice that most of the cars that explode in his movies are Ford cars. That's because Ford gives him hundreds and hundreds of broken vehicles to explode. And they give him these vehicles that are broken anyway. So there's a cost there, but not massive. And he then gets to blow them up and it looks impressive. I don't know if they also pay or who pays whom. I don't know if it's at a discount or whatever. But the point is there is a massive saving there. So if you can do something through product placement, you can either get paid for it or you can get the product at a discount, which is kind of interesting. And again, using Michael Bay, one of the other things that he does that saves money, quote unquote, in an unusual way is that he works very closely with the Army or the Navy or the Air Force. And so whenever you see battleships or you see lots of troops and stuff, there's a good chance that they're real battleships, that they really are the Army, because they are, I mean, it could be visual effects or actors, but there's a good chance with the Michael Bay movie that it's the real thing. Certainly on Army bases and stuff like that, it's much easier to get the Army on side than it is to build an Army base yourself. And the way they do that is that all the scripts make the Army and the Navy look good, and the Air Force. You know what I mean? There's no point in any Michael Bay film does the Army do something stupid. And that's fine, because all of his films are talking about killing killer robots and aliens. And so it's not like it is low level propaganda, but it's cultural propaganda rather than active kind of, you know, and we could debate the rights and wrongs of that. But the point is that that's a compromise they've made, or a choice they've made that saved them a lot of cash in an unusual way. But the other thing is, quite often you can save money a lot in almost every stage in very small creative ways. So, for example, early on, when you've got a script and the director is working out how they're going to shoot it, they'll do a storyboard where they'll work with an artist to draw every single shot that they intend to have. And they might do it on a computer now with 3D animation. And you can do a very complicated one called an animatic, where it's actually animated and things. And, you know, you can go quite far down that route of making the film before you make it. But for all of the history of film, we've had the ability to draw storyboards and stuff. And Hitchcock used to draw every frame. And the reason that can save you a lot of money is if the scene says something like, the character is sitting in his hospital bed and he checks his phone and then he says, oh no, like that's the scene, right? It's just a tiny little scene. If you only have that information, you're probably going to find a hospital, build a hospital, probably put loads of extras in with nurses and doctors and whatever. But if the director says, I'm going to do this as a single shot that's slowly going to move towards the actor, and you're only ever going to see him and his bed, then suddenly you could film that in any location you're already planning to be in. You just need a hospital bed and maybe a sign that says hospital behind him and maybe a machine. And the rest of it will be done in post-production by the audio team, the sounds of hospitals and stuff. And actually, you could just film it anywhere there's a white wall. And suddenly you've gone from having to build an entire set and move everybody to something you can grab just after lunch. And that is just a creative choice the director has made. So quite often, the way you save money in film is planning. I have a friend who's a visual effects supervisor, and she's very, very good at her job. And she said that when she turns up on set, she doesn't always need to, but she likes to be on set. And she said that she saves tens of thousands of dollars every day by leaning over to the director or the cameraman and saying, could you just move the frame a little bit to the left? Because if you can frame out that thing on the top right, we don't have to do any visual effects, and it will save you £20,000 to not have to do that shot. And the director can then choose, no, actually, it's really important that we see the city in the background. Or, oh, yeah, sure, I didn't care. I don't care if we see that window, that you then have to build the scene, the city behind it. And so, yeah, planning and working between the different departments is usually a very creative way of saving shockingly large amounts of money. And conversely, lack of communication, lack of planning. I mean, I won't name the films, but I know of many huge films that have had entire armies, as in they literally have put loads of actors in makeup on top of a hill, hundreds of them as extras. And then the directors said, no, I meant the other hill. That was a Hollywood film where that literally happened. And I won't say the name because I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but an entire day was wasted and hundreds of actors in full fantasy makeup.
Oh, no.
And so that's just bad communication on a number of levels. It may or may not be the director's fault, but there's a number of failures along the way.
No, it's quite. I think that is quite interesting. I mean, in terms of being employing people to be worth employing in terms of the value they bring to the production, not just in producing the film, but then also saving money in areas like that. So I guess you can be as controversial or not controversial as you want on this next question, but I thought just a little bit about casting, really. Are actors and actresses really worth their wage?
Well, it's a really good question, and it all depends on what you think you're paying them for. Because if you think you're paying them to represent the character very well on set, they're doing a good job acting, and they really embody the character and they tell the story well, then many actors are overpaid. Because many of the stars are overpaid because there are better actors than some of the stars. Some of the stars are brilliant actors, but some of them you'd all acknowledge they're not the most flexible actor. And so I'm not going to name names just because I don't need to, and I don't want to. It just will distract us more than anything else. But you could say many times that someone's a star and they're actually not a particularly good actor. Some are. Some, like Jim Carrey, is an incredible creative talent and a star. But there are other actors that I'm sure we can think of that are just not particularly good at their job. When if you define their job as embodying the character on the script. However, that's not really their job. Their job, as the way that Hollywood works today, is to sell movies and to get you in the screen. So, for example, The Rock, who I really like, and I'm not passing judgment on his acting ability or not, but one of the most valuable thing The Rock does when he signs up to your movie and he's in your movie is that he goes on all the chat shows at the end. He does viral videos. He does the interview circuit. He seems charming and lovely, and he's everywhere, right? And that's awesome because more people hear about your movie, more people like him, they want to see him, so my interpretation of it, certainly the stars, so this only works for the top few names in each movie and only if they're famous. Their job is to sell the movie, and secondary, it's to be in the movie, which maybe is a good or bad thing. I don't know, but it's a reality. For an independent movie, when they're not famous and nothing about them will make people go and see it beyond their talent, then it's more about the work they do on the day and how good they are. And, but I guess that's the same as sort of, if you go to a foreign country and you see a little restaurant and you have no context for whether it's a good or bad restaurant, the quality of the food is the main thing you're going to be thinking about. But if you're in an alien place and you see a McDonald's or some other chain that you like or whatever, then you might go there because of the branding, because the food's going to be mediocre, but it's going to be the kind of mediocre that you can predict and that you feel comfortable with, or it reminds you of home or whatever. And I think that's the important thing to think about actors, is to what percentage of their money are they earning through branding and ticket sales, and on the other hand, what percentage are they earning from turning up each day and making you cry or think, or you know.
I think this is really fascinating, and I'm hoping that we can come back together and discuss probably a bit more about the indie films
Sure.
and more specifics on that, because I think we're probably covering more on the sort of big budget type
Yeah.
stuff, sort of stuff that I guess most of us are familiar with in sort of the commercial part of the industry that churns out all these films for typical moviegoers like me. And it kind of links into what you said there. So I think you might have already answered this question, but so from my perspective, a lot of the big budget movies appear to be all the comic book franchises, and I've lost track of them, if I'm honest. To what extent are big budget films all about films like that, big comic book franchises, and why do they always appear to be sort of stuff that we might have seen in the past?
Well, it goes back to what we're talking about is risk, but it's not even risk. It's the perception of risk. So we're getting a bit meta here, because it's not where is the risk. It's what do the key gatekeepers perceive of as risk. And so they might say, well, is it going to be any good? So therefore we'll hire the people that have made the things that we liked last time. Or they'll say, will the audience want to see this? Okay, we'll just make the same thing they made before. And to some degree, like I've been talking a lot about how the film industry is doing quote unquote dumb things, consistently, but they're doing that because that's what we as audience members are rewarding. We hear about, like, so let's say the journey of someone, like, let's say that you hear about a new movie coming out and you think, wow, that's terrible. And I'll relate it back to something that when this thought occurred to me many years ago, was that they announced that they were making a film of the game Battleship, like A1 hit, A2 miss. And I was like, well, that sounds like a stupid idea. And then they announced it starred Liam Neeson and Rihanna. And I was like, well, that doesn't make me think it's going to be any better. And you see the trailer and the poster and you think it looks awful. And then for whatever reason, I went to go and see it with some friends. I thought this is going to be terrible, but friends want to see it. So you buy your ticket, you go in, you laugh throughout the movie because you think it's not very good. And you come out feeling very smug. I know what they should have done. But the thing is, as soon as I bought a ticket, I voted for that movie. Because Hollywood doesn't care if I have notes. It doesn't care whether I enjoyed it. It cares whether I gave them money and whether I'll give them money again. And so we, as cinema goers, are giving feedback and signals to the studios. And if you look at Marvel and the journey they've gone on, they've only been able to do that because it was successful. Iron Man was not a very big budget Hollywood movie. It wasn't, and Robert Downey Jr. wasn't a big star. He was well known and a terrific actor, but he wasn't the superstar that he is now. That happened because they were good and because people liked them and because they, so it's a mix. Again, McDonald's is a good example. If the food was genuinely terrible, by everyone thought so, it would flop. They don't have funders outside of their customers. And so what they're having to do is to try and give people the same but different. They're trying to give people something that's good, but also take out the risk, the perceived risk. And the way to do that is quite often to hire the people that did it last time. And that can create a reductive loop where you're always making derivative material. Or one of the things that Marvel is quite good at, and probably a large part of their success, is they're quite good at creative revisionism. So they hire people who are some of the directors are quite on the fringe. Taika Waititi and stuff like that is not your natural director for a big budget movie. He wouldn't have got hired in the 90s, during the era of Michael Bay or whomever. And so you've got to have creative renewal. And so a lot of these Marvel films, although they are all Marvel films, they're definitely within a category of their own. They are different between them. Some are more dramatic, some are funnier. I mean, Ant-Man is a full-on comedy, whereas Thor 2 is not. And so it's that mix of new and different, but it all comes from perceived risk. And I guess, as I said, we're buying these films, we're watching these films, and it doesn't matter if we're watching them and rolling our eyes. If we're paying for them or giving them our attention, we're encouraging more of them to be made. It's the only signal that really, at the end of the day, matters.
The one aspect I didn't really look at, which is the nuance that you mentioned there, which is it's sort of like the box is familiar to us, but the creative renewal is what's inside that box.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like you say, even though we think we know what we're going to get from it, the trick is for the movie makers is to make that creativity within that package that we're already familiar with, because that package is sort of the de-risking element for the people who hold the purse strings, isn't it? So I guess sort of we've mentioned a bit about post production, and sort of one of the reasons why I actually sort of approached you in the first place is when I was doing some research and trying to look at, I'm looking at the cost of the movie soundtracks, because I've always been fascinated with movie soundtracks. I think they're great. In a really sad way, I use them when I'm working out, like running and things like that. And
You find many people do, because they're written to give you an emotional journey without distracting you. They're often there to hype you up and make you feel things. I think that's the biggest life post the actual movie, is studying, reading, running, whatever it would be. So I think you'll find a lot of people do what you're doing.
there must be quite a significant cost associated with having, a good soundtrack. I don't know whether that's just an assumption on my part, but I guess it's once the composer is an established and sort of reliable composer. I'm thinking like the John Williams or the Hans Zimmers. Those kind of ones are, I'm assuming they're quite expensive or pretty much impossible to get on board without a guarantee that the film's any good, and then or is produced by someone recognized, versus having that random soundtrack that all of a sudden everyone becomes familiar with, and it just becomes it becomes part of the movie, and a familiar part of the movie in and of itself. So I'm thinking on that side of things, I'm thinking like, was it Brad Fiedel who did the Terminator soundtrack and then never produced another soundtrack ever again? you know, so
I
so
always want to have the balls to do that. If you ever succeed so greatly at the first time you try anything, I always want to like never do it again and be that guy. I don't think I have the strength to do that, sadly.
No, exactly. But so those are key decisions, and but music happens post production, doesn't it? So it happens towards the end of the movie.
So let's think about what these are. This is the intersection of film and art, film and music. Music often stands alone when you listen to a piece of music or a classical piece, but here it's there to serve the wider picture. It's there to serve literally the picture, but I meant the movie. The emotional journey. So it's an absolutely vital part of the process, but it's also one part of the process. And most composers will say, if you get them on, the earlier you get them on, the better the work will be, because they can think about themes, they can think about ideas. I mean, with Interstellar, Hans Zimmer was brought on board while he was still, before there was a script. And it can give you times to think about it. And many composers I know complain that they get brought on at the last minute. But if you think about the costs of creating a score, which is so a score is the classical music. It doesn't have to be classical music, but traditionally it's classical music that's behind the scenes of the scenes. And then the soundtrack is all of the existing songs that come from different places. I'm a Believer or whatever, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, that come together, that maybe are played in the middle of the movie or maybe at the end of the credits. And so the score and the soundtrack, they have similar journeys, but the difference is the score is made for the picture, what we call spotted to the picture. So the picture, the edit exists, and then you make it completely synchronized. Whereas the soundtrack is the collection of existing commercial music just brought together.
I think there's some just there. I think there's some great footage, and I don't exactly know where. I might have to search for this and put it in the description of where John Williams is doing the score for E.T. And they're showing sort of the original sort of footage that Steven Spielberg is filming John Williams with his orchestra doing the score to I don't know which scene it was. I think it's the scene where E.T. and Elliot go flying in the bike, and how much of a difference that actually makes to the overall impact of the scene.
Oh, it's huge. Like, I think a lot of composers have a bugbear, and I think they're right, that people underappreciate the music. It's quite an intangible cost when you think about the physical or visual costs that people have spent before. They're also at the end of the process, and so that always means no one has enough time or money, which is annoying for them. But let's think about that image of John Williams. He's conducting the London Symphony Orchestra, the LSO, whatever, and he's written the music, and they're reading it off and they're recording it. So there's two sets of costs there. The big one is John Williams. Like, he is a talent. He is someone who's got a rate card, and like you said, will be expensive. And also he has spent the preceding months or whatever watching the film while it's being edited, thinking about it, writing the music, checking the music, getting it approved, and that can be quite a long process. And then there's the day of the record, where they've got to pay for the LSO, where suddenly you've gone from essentially one person who gets paid a lot to loads of people who aren't paid enough. There are music union rates and stuff, but musicians work hard for their money without a lot of job security and things. And so how can you reduce those costs? Well, the first cost, the John Williams cost, you can hire someone who's less famous. And so most composers, like most artists on their way up, will work for essentially nothing. They shouldn't, but everyone works quite hard to make the art and to get known. And so that's just commercial rates, as you've already alluded to. Like how much he's worth is kind of how much he can ask for and how many other people are offering him money at the same time. But when you come to the recording of it, there's a lot of flexibility, but it really changes the end product in sort of hard to determine ways that have a big effect. So you can pay the LSO and have, I don't know how many that is, but let's say 100 musicians. That's a lot. And they're really highly paid, and you've got to be in a nice, huge recording studio with good engineers. That will cost tens and tens of thousands of dollars straight away, right? And if you've got to have them for a few days or whatever, then it's going to cost double that, 3 times that if it's 3 days. But you can nowadays, what they say is program music, where essentially there's a computer program that knows what a horn sounds like and will make the horn whenever the note of E whenever you want. And so you can create all of that from your bedroom in theory, and it could sound the same. Realistically, it doesn't sound the same because there's something intangible about the real world, and also a lot of it comes down to the skill of the programmer. Programming is what they call it, where you try and add reverb, you try and make this bigger or smaller. Also, what kind of samples you have. So Hans Zimmer does a lot of sampling. He will also do recording, but he'll also do a hybrid where, for example, he will go with a drummer and a series of drums and go and record each sort of boom, boom, and then take that, and that's a live sound, and then he'll take that into his computer, and him and his team will then use that to make the soundtrack, as well as doing perhaps some live record. Because, composers I know that try and juggle this sort of, I don't have enough money, but I have some money, might program the vast majority of the orchestra, but then have a live cello, a live violin, and a live drummer, whatever the key pieces of music instruments are, to add it depth to it. It's weird to think about, and I'm not enough of a audiophile to be able to tell, but I have friends of mine who are composers who've played me like, here is this piece of music programmed and here is it recorded live. And the only way I can describe it in my ignorant fashion is the live version feels 3D and the program version feels 2D. It just feels flatter somehow intangibly. And it's one of those things that goes into the mix of, did you hire the right actors? Is the dialogue any good? Was it a nice day in the weather? And how good's the soundtrack? That all comes together into whether that moment on screen felt real and moved you enough to say it's a 5-star movie or a 2-star movie. But then when you think about the commercial aspect of these soundtracks, most scores, I haven't done the data on this, but my understanding is that most scores don't sell very well because people don't tend to go and buy them that much, but they also do well in comparison. They're heavily connected to how good the movie is, which in theory should have nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing to do with it. But people like familiar things. If you like, for example, if you really like Gladiator, and the soundtrack to Gladiator is great, but there's probably other albums by other artists, whether they're soundtracks or not, that you've never heard of, that probably are as good or not better in the same style of music, but you're never going to discover them because, again, branding. You're not going to have that, oh yeah, Gladiator, that made me feel.
Yeah.
And I seem to remember from as a kid that Titanic kept bringing out music inspired by the film, and they brought out 4 or 5 albums with Titanic written on them, and some of them had music that was released before Titanic came out, but was still on an album listed as inspired by the film, which is, again, the ultimate version of branding, and there's no reason. I mean, the music and the score for Titanic are top notch, very, very good, but they're not 5 albums worth better than other things that don't have the same branding. But Titanic was the biggest film ever for a long period of time. And so everything did well, whether it's lunchboxes or soundtracks. So yeah, it's complicated.
So your opinion in terms of the cost of these films and budgets being important, are these films getting too big? Are they getting too risky? Are they at risk of are big budget blockbusters at risk of disappearing?
Well, I think one of the things that we should remember in this conversation, in this wider conversation that people are talking about this, is that it's not our problem. As in, like, we should totally talk about it, but it's Disney's problem. And if Disney makes a ton of money or doesn't make any money or loses money or goes bankrupt, what do I care? Someone else will come along, some other studio. So the idea that there will be big budget entertainment is not in any way at risk in any way, because like the film industry will keep producing them, whether it's the same people or not, who cares? But so I'm not dismissing the question. It's just to say that we don't have to worry about this because we're not paying proportionally to how much the budget is. So this is quite often, if I said a restaurant's overpriced, your immediate feeling is that you're being scammed and you could be paying less for the same quality. That's not the case with movies because the time and effort you have to put into watching a movie is locked. It's fixed. It's not related to how much they spend. So this is rich people problems. Is Jeff Bezos paying enough for his space rockets kind of thing? What's happened over the years, and there's always been an evolution of big budget movies because there used to be big budget musicals, and then we had epics, and then we started to have blockbusters with things like Jaws and Star Wars, and then you went through a period in the 90s where you had very particular types, and then we've moved more into the 2000s, and we've had, as we talked about already, like comic book movies and things like that. One of the things that has happened in this sort of ebb and flow of how budgets are shifting is that what Hollywood would regard as a mid-budget movie, so maybe $30 to $60 million movie, whatever. And that also shifts with inflation and things. But a mid-budget movie has it hasn't disappeared, but it's quite hard to make those kinds of movies. And we talked earlier on about the Steve Jobs movie. That's very much one of those movies because they perhaps belong on television. Perhaps they belong with streamers. But making lower budget films is easier than ever before because the technology is so cheap now. You could make a film on your iPhone and, there was a film that won Sundance that was shot on an iPhone. So we all have the technology in theory to make a film. And at the high end, these movies are getting much more expensive, but they're getting much better at the exploitation of those rights. And, almost all of these big budget movies are making a lot of money. So they're shifting. I mean, look at Bond, which has been released recently, which is crazy expensive, but also going to make crazy amounts of money. And so what's happened is that there's been this flight to big or to small. Can you make this smaller, in which case the risk is smaller and therefore it doesn't have to do as well? Or can we make this bigger? And if we do, at that point, we have to spend even more to guarantee that it's going to work. We have to, if you're going to spend an extra 100 million on a movie, you better make sure you've got a few extra very well-known famous people in it. You better spend another 100 million on the marketing to make sure people go and see it, at which point maybe it'll be fine. So what's tricky in these mid-budget movies that used to exist a lot more than they do now is that they were movies that weren't huge blockbusters, but they still weren't cheap. And they had famous people in them, but they weren't necessarily like a cast of 10 unbelievably famous people. And those films have started to be made less and less proportionally, but not nearly as much as, they're not doomed. It's not that they'll never get made. And to some degree, that's the budget range for Joker. Joker was around 50 million, I think. And it was wildly successful for its budget range, hugely profitable film because it managed to deliver enough to enough people that they were like, wow, I really want to see this. So it will be a constant creative flow of destruction of things, people not doing certain types of things. Someone does it well, everyone else goes back to it. During the 80s, there was a law of the industry that pirate movies never worked. And then one of the most successful franchises of all time, the Pirates of the Caribbean, came along. So things are true until they're not in the film industry. And what's true right now is that mid-budget movies are struggling and that you have to make your big movies bigger and your small movies smaller. But that's only going to be true until it's not. And I don't know what Marvel is going to do or how successful it's going to be because they need to do constant reinvention. And to some degree, they have the same problem that Facebook have, that Match.com has. Anyone who has had a fast ascension to the top of a fast-moving industry and has succeeded through innovation, but now needs to solidify their position. The terrorists that become the political leaders, how do they prevent future terrorists from overtaking them? That's something that Marvel and these studios are kind of got to reckon with over the next 10 years. But as I said, I don't think we should feel sorry for them. I don't know what they're going to do, and they might really mess it up royally. I don't really care.
Yeah. Poor Disney.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Like, how funny does that sound? Because also I'm not sharing in their riches. Like if I owned a big chunk of Disney, maybe I'd feel differently. And I'm also not saying like I wish them any ill. It's just that we have to remember that the industry is trying to get us to care what the number one movie in America was last week. It's trying to get us to care how much they spent on this or how important this is, and we shouldn't because. Yeah. We should care whether we're going to waste our 2 hours and £10 on the ticket or whatever it is. Like, that's what we should care about.
Right. And at risk of wasting 2 hours and going off to be almost Martin Scorsese level of production on this podcast in terms of duration, I think the last question for me for now is where can listeners go and find out more about your work? Because I found your website just purely when I was trying to research costs, and it's a real treasure trove of information on movies. So and that's stephenfollows.com, and I'll link to that in the description, of course. But yeah, so generally, what kind of stuff are you up to? When can listeners get more from you?
Well, they definitely go to my blog. I've got hundreds of articles. I've done this for about 10 years, and I'm really interested in looking at data and the film industry. So I would highly suggest searching the site and having a look at something that's interesting to you. You can reach out to me via the site as well. I tend to use that more than I use social media. I was doing increasing amounts of teaching around the world pre-pandemic, and so I would normally have a kind of, I'm going to be in this part of the world at this time, but I'm still figuring out what I'm doing. I think I'm going to be in New York in April next year, but that's not very useful for anyone to start making plans or booking tickets. But I'd suggest I have a free weekly mailing list. So on the website, you can put your email address in. Every week, you'll get an email from me with some new research or a link to an old piece of research I've done and some articles that are relevant that I found over the press. And that's what it is. And from there, I also announce when I have, whether they be physical or online teaching things. But if you've made it all the way, if you've listened to this podcast and you've made it all the way through the conversation and you think you and I would get on with the conversation, reach out to me because you're probably right. One of the nice things about niche things on the internet is that it's self-filtering. And so if you've got a question or something you want to know about film, reach out. Google it first, but then reach out. I can't promise I can help, but I promise I would like to. And maybe we can geek out together.
And that's the end of the movie. My thanks to Stephen Follows for the amazing insight into the cost of movies. The value of having people in the team to save money, I would say, is greater than the value of good actors. But then I'm biased. I'm off to get some popcorn and I'll be watching The Godfather. Thanks for listening and have a great week.